James Carter let out a slow breath, trying to keep his cool as he wiped the water from his face. The evening air was still warm, the faint scent of chlorine mixing with the lingering heat of the day. He had just finished his nightly swim, something he often did to clear his mind after long, stressful workdays. As the owner of the apartment complex, he enjoyed the simple routine of closing the pool himself. It was peaceful, usually. But tonight, peace was the last thing he was going to get. "Excuse me." A sharp voice rang out from behind him, cutting through the quiet. "What do you think you're doing?" James turned around slowly, his fingers still gripping the gate he had just been about to lock. A woman stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked to be in her late 40s or early 50s, with a stiff, manicured bob and an expression that screamed entitlement. She had that look, one James had encountered too many times before. "I'm closing the pool," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "No, you're not," she snapped. James frowned. He had no idea who this woman was, but from the way she was glaring at him, she seemed convinced that he had no business being here. He took a step forward, still holding onto the gate. "Yes, I am. The pool closes at 10, and I'm the one who locks it up every night." "That's funny," she said, tilting her head, "because I've never seen you here before." James sighed. He knew exactly where this was going. "Ma'am, I own this building," he said, emphasizing each word. "This is my property." The woman's face twisted into a smirk, as if she didn't believe a word he was saying. "Oh, really?" she scoffed. "You own this place? You expect me to believe that?" James stared at her, his patience wearing thin. He had dealt with this kind of ignorance before. People who refused to believe that a black man could be anything other than a tenant, a worker, or worse, someone trespassing where he didn't belong. "You can believe whatever you want," he said, reaching for his keys, "but that doesn't change the facts." The woman's hand shot up, and before James could react, she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she announced, her voice loud and confident, like she was sure the law was on her side. "There's a suspicious man at the pool. I don't know what he's doing, but he refuses to leave." James's stomach twisted in frustration. He could already picture how this was going to go, how it could go if he wasn't careful. He had heard too many stories, seen too many videos of situations just like this spiraling out of control. But what this woman didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that James was about to uncover something that would turn this entire situation upside down. James watched as the woman paced in small circles, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. He could hear snippets of her conversation, her voice exaggerated, dripping with false concern. "Yes, I'm at the apartment pool, and there's a man here who refuses to leave," she said. "I don't know who he is, but he's acting aggressive." James felt his fists clench at his sides. Aggressive? He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't even stepped toward her. But he knew how this worked. He knew how a story could be twisted, how a few carefully chosen words could change everything. His heart pounded as he debated his next move. He could walk away, head back to his unit, and let her deal with the embarrassment when the police arrived and realized he was the owner. But something about the way she carried herself, the smugness in her tone, made him stay. The woman glanced at him and took a step back, as if she expected him to lunge at her. "Yes?" She continued into the phone. "I feel very unsafe." James let out a slow breath. "Stay calm." A few minutes later, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. His jaw tightened. This was escalating way too fast. Within moments, 2 police officers stepped onto the pool deck, their flashlights cutting through the dim evening light. James stood still, hands visible at his sides, watching as they approached. "There he is!" the woman shrieked, pointing at him. "That's the man I was telling you about. He refuses to leave, and he threatened me." James let out a short, humorless laugh. "I didn't threaten anyone," he said firmly. The officers exchanged a glance before turning their attention to him. "Sir, can we see some identification?" one of them asked, his tone neutral, for now. James nodded, reaching into his pocket slowly. He wasn't about to give them any reason to think he was a threat. He pulled out his wallet and handed them his ID. The officer took it, glancing down before furrowing his brow. His eyes flickered to James, then back to the ID, and then to his partner. "Wait a second," the officer muttered. He turned the ID over, inspecting it more closely. "You're the owner of this property?" "That's right," James said. The second officer looked at the woman who had been standing with her arms crossed, waiting for them to remove him. "Ma'am, did you know he was the owner?" The color drained from her face. "Well, no," she stammered. But, but how was I supposed to know that? He didn't look like the owner." James narrowed his eyes. There it was. The first officer sighed and handed James back his ID. "Sir, sorry for the trouble," he said before turning back to the woman. "Ma'am, did you just call 911 on the owner of this building?" The woman opened her mouth to argue, but James wasn't done. He had just remembered something. Something that could change everything. "You know what?" he said, his voice calm but sharp. "I'd like to check the security footage." The woman's face paled at James's words. She shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the straps of her expensive-looking purse. The police officers exchanged another glance, waiting to see what James meant. "Security footage?" the first officer asked. James nodded. "That's right. There are cameras all over this property, including one right by the pool entrance." He gestured toward the small, barely noticeable camera mounted on the nearby fence. "Since I own this building, I have access to all the recordings. Shouldn't be too hard to check the footage and see exactly what happened here tonight." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "This was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" James repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You called 911 and told them I was being aggressive, that you felt unsafe. Now you don't want to verify what actually happened?" The officers looked at each other again. The second one, who had been mostly silent up until now, finally spoke. "Actually, sir, that's not a bad idea. If there's footage, it could clear this whole thing up." The woman let out a nervous laugh, taking a small step backward. "I mean, really, what's the point? You're the owner, fine. I admit I made a mistake." James folded his arms. He wasn't letting this go. He had seen it too many times. People like her using the police as their personal enforcers, dialing 911 like it was customer service for their entitlement. She had been so confident when she made that call, so sure that the officers would show up and force him to leave. But now that she knew the truth, she was backpedaling. "You were ready to have me arrested," James said, his voice low and steady. "All because I didn't look like someone who could own this building. That's a serious accusation, and honestly, I'd love to see what the footage has to say about it." The woman's breath hitched. She glanced at the officers, then back at James. I don't want any trouble," she muttered. James tilted his head. "That's funny. You didn't mind causing trouble when you were calling 911 a few minutes ago." One of the officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, did this gentleman actually do anything threatening, or was this just a mistake?" The woman hesitated, but she could see the writing on the wall. She was cornered. If James really did have footage, there'd be no way for her to spin the story in her favor. She let out a dramatic sigh, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "Fine," she grumbled. "I may have overreacted." James chuckled dryly. "Overreacted? You called the police on the owner of the property and lied about him being a threat. That's more than an overreaction." The second officer sighed. "Ma'am, you know filing a false police report is a crime, right?" The woman's eyes widened. "Wait, what? No, I didn't lie. I just—" She stopped herself, realizing she had no good excuse. James smiled. "Well, let's just check the footage and find out, shall we?" The woman's breathing grew uneven as James pulled out his phone, logging into the security system's app. Her gaze darted between him and the officers, her confidence cracking with every second. "Look," she said, forcing a nervous laugh. "We don't have to make a big deal out of this. It was just a simple misunderstanding." James didn't even look up. His fingers moved swiftly, pulling up the live feed and rewinding to the last hour. "Funny how these misunderstandings always seem to happen when someone like me is involved," he muttered. The first officer sighed. "Ma'am, you called the police and made serious claims about this man being a threat. If that wasn't true, then yes, this is a big deal." The woman swallowed hard, gripping her purse strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. Meanwhile, James found the moment he was looking for. The footage loaded, showing him at the pool, swimming laps under the soft glow of the pool lights. The timestamp confirmed it. He had been alone, minding his own business. Then, a few minutes later, the woman appeared on the screen, standing near the pool entrance. She wasn't in distress. She wasn't backing away in fear. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, watching James with clear suspicion. James hit play, and the officers leaned in. On screen, the woman suddenly shouted something. Though there was no audio, her body language was telling. James turned toward her, his posture relaxed, making no sudden movements. She stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger at him. James responded calmly, but the woman shook her head and pulled out her phone. The officers exchanged a glance. James looked at her now, watching her squirm. "Where exactly was I aggressive?" he asked. The woman's mouth opened, then shut. She had no answer. James fast-forwarded to when the officers arrived. The footage clearly showed her dramatically pointing at him, speaking into the phone with exaggerated distress. Then, there was a particular moment, right before they arrived, where she smirked. James smirked right back at her. "You looked pretty pleased with yourself before the cops showed up, almost like you wanted me to get in trouble." The first officer sighed. "Well, that settles it. Ma'am, you not only wasted our time, but you also misled dispatch." He shook his head. "You know that could have ended very differently for him, don't you?" The woman's face flushed a deep red. James wasn't done. He turned to the officers. "I'm pressing charges for a false police report." The woman gasped. "What? No, that's not necessary." "It is," James said firmly, "because next time it might not just be me. It might be someone else, someone who doesn't have security footage, someone who gets arrested or worse because of a lie." The second officer nodded. "We'll need to take your statement." James glanced at the woman. Her arrogance was gone now, replaced with something else. Fear. Good. The silence was heavy, stretching between them like an invisible force. The woman, whose arrogance had been so evident minutes ago, now stood frozen, her face pale and her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form an argument that didn't exist. But there was nothing she could say. The security footage didn't lie. James folded his arms across his chest, his eyes locked on her. He had seen this play out before, had watched people like her weaponize fear, their words carrying more weight simply because of who they were and who he was. This time, though, she wasn't getting away with it. The first officer sighed and pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am, we need to get your full name and ID." The woman stiffened. "Wait, you're really doing this? I told you. It was a misunderstanding." James let out a dry chuckle. "A misunderstanding? You mean when you told the police I was aggressive and that you felt unsafe? That kind of misunderstanding?" The woman's jaw clenched. "I." The second officer shook his head. "Ma'am, do you realize how serious this could have been? You called in a false report about an innocent man. Do you understand what might have happened if we had arrived with different expectations? If we had approached him thinking he was dangerous?" She lowered her gaze, shifting uncomfortably. I didn't know who he was," she muttered. James scoffed. "That's the thing, isn't it? You saw a black man in a pool and assumed he didn't belong. You didn't ask questions. You didn't think twice before calling the police. And you lied to make me seem like a threat." The woman looked at the officers, then back at James, her expression a mix of panic and frustration. "I didn't lie. I felt uncomfortable. Can't you understand that?" James shook his head. "No, because I don't get the luxury of making a call every time I feel uncomfortable. If I did that, I'd be on the phone all the time." The first officer finished writing in his notepad and let out a tired sigh. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us. We're taking you in for filing a false police report." Her eyes widened. "Wait, no. You don't have to do that." She turned to James, her voice desperate. "Please, you don't have to press charges. I wasn't thinking straight." James tilted his head. "You were thinking clearly enough to make sure you sounded afraid on that call." Tears welled in her eyes, but James wasn't moved. He wasn't being cruel. He was being fair. He had been given the rare chance to hold someone accountable for what so many others had gotten away with, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The second officer stepped forward, taking her by the arm. "Ma'am, let's go." As they led her away, James exhaled deeply, the weight of the night settling in. This time, justice had been served.